Mic check. So if I say C, you say TI. C? C? Okay. So this is the audience of today. A lot of excitement, huh? You guys excited or what? Okay. Let's turn this stuff up, right? My name is Gert-Jan Bruggink. Let me put on the timer so that I'm on time. What I will be talking about today is just sharing some thoughts on something that is really close to my heart, which is building a certain deliverable in the CTI realm. And instead of what we in the industry usually do is just focus on nuts and bolts and figures, I'd like to actually think of it more like a journey. You know, where are we going? And to that extent, it's the same like people selling a car, right? They don't sell like how hard it can go and the measurements. They sell the journey. I'm going to try to do that today with you guys as well. So from my experience, every one of you probably have seen this or is currently in the process of doing a similar thing, which is that you kind of see, hey, a report coming in, this is what we saw last quarter, or this is what we think that will happen next year. But what is actually happening? This is actually happening a lot, you know? There's a lot of reports coming in. And what that results into, and a lot of the teams I help with, is that they have to go through all of these reports and then determine, you know, what does that mean for me, right? And I think that is an interesting problem, so to say. And I think one of the solutions is actually that you need to know what that actually is, what the product of a threat landscape actually is, and how you can condense all of that into a single deliverable. In short, there's a couple of things I noted down, what I'm good at, what I like to do. Most importantly, I spend my time specializing in cyber threat intelligence, focusing on mostly on structured threat content, testing threat scenarios, building threat scenarios, and then doing actually something with that, helping organizations prepare accordingly. I have some specialties in certain industries, and I certainly love Lego. You probably noticed that. But I also like to do some volunteering and to support the community. As part of that, I'm also involved with these kind of things, you know, sharing my knowledge, making it, let's say, more scalable, if you will. And you know, I'm really motivated by sharing my expertise and just pouring all the knowledge I have into all of you. And that is also why I've last year set up my own company to actually do that kind of thing. And second, also to pioneer the concept of structured threat content. So I'm going to talk about three things, keeping it simple. What is this thing? How do you do it? And some do's and don'ts. To be fair, early yesterday, we had a good 4-hour workshop of this particular session. So some of you might have already seen the content, which is fine. Just stick around. It's way easier now. It's just 25 minutes. So that's probably a lot better than 4 hours, right? But my idea is to just give you, like, how do you do this kind of thing? What does that entail? How do you make that happen? And it actually starts by defining what it is. But actually, we need to go one step before that, before we can actually say what it is. And that's actually, where is this concept coming from? And without a long, elaborate discussion, I think where it starts is the differences between the private sector and the public sector. Private sector meaning businesses, right, making money. Public sector being government agencies, all that kind of stuff. And what you kind of see happening is that this it's not a deliverable, it is a concept which is actually used to illustrate a certain piece of an environment. So for example, if you would be ex-military or ex-something like that, then you probably recognize this kind of concept. You never know the full extent of an environment. You never know the full extent of a landscape. But you do know that you have to go from A to B, and you have to understand the terrain you're going through, if there are hills, if there are something. It's a battle space preparation to actually make sure that you make the right decisions. Strategic, tactical, operational, whatever. But in the private sector, we sometimes view it as a finite solution, like a mapped aspect with all sorts of colors nicely added to that. And I think that perception is not necessarily wrong, but it's important for all of you to recognize those differences. Second, I think it's also important to note that, and the public angle knows that, is that you can never be 100% correct, you know? So if a certain report comes in, out of all of those 100 you receive, then it could very well be that not all of them actually apply 100% to you because of reasons, right? You have to keep those things in mind, and it's seriously different. And this also leads to what people think this kind of thing actually is. I personally believe this is more of a concept than an actual thing you send out every quarter or every year, which is fine. But I'm like, this is a golden opportunity to actually standardize the understanding of a threat landscape across your entire organization. And that is, you know, people just ask me like, hey, Gert-Jan, can you make like this thing perfectly for us? I'm like, sure I can do anything you want. That is cool. But I think there's still, if I would ask each and every one of you, like, what is this thing? I would get, you know, 200, 300 different answers, which is fine. But in general, I strongly believe that this is a concept that allows you to standardize the way we talk about threats in your given organization, industry, vertical, whatever. Talk in the same language, if you will. And in the private sector, I tend to believe that there are three main types, so to say. One being the most recognizable is somebody wanted to know something like, what is this? Is DDoS a certain problem? We want to track that specific thing. Okay, that could be a requirement, right? But you can also look at it more abstract, like who is doing that? Can we track that over time basis? Typically, people ask questions. And if you have questions, you can rephrase them as so-called intelligence requirements. Most of you probably will be familiar with this concept. And I like to refer to those as the requirements-based threat landscapes. And obviously, we have even more variants. We have the research-based threat landscapes. And that is, as the illustration already signals, it's like a limited view of two different colors. So you only get red and you only get yellow, but that's the telemetry that the particular entity has, right? So that means that you only can get orange in the middle, which is just the juice. And if that is what you need, then that's good, but it's good to keep that in mind. Finally, the guesstimate one. This might seem like a catch-all type of thing. It certainly isn't. This is the type of example which you would use when you just land in an organization, or you just want to do something, you just want to get this type of concept going. I tend to believe that it's better to start with more to the left, but you know, sometimes you just got to do what you think is right and start with something, and that's what you do in this type of threat landscape. Now, a lot of with all due respect, my vendor friends, a lot of my vendor friends sometimes say that they produce a certain threat landscape for a certain industry using their tool, and that is the finite solution to all your problems. I think that is shit. I don't think that is true. I think you always need to do some sort of analysis to make it fit for you, right? And I think they will all agree that is the case, but that nuance sometimes gets lost in the weeds. You cannot automatically generate these type of products because you alone know exactly what's going on in the organization. You know your organization. And if that is difficult sometimes, you cannot automate that. So I think that having a robot paint something is cool, but use it for specific stuff. Use it to collect different stuff together and use that then to your advantage to do stuff faster. Now, where do you begin? Where do you begin this journey, you know? I tend to start with either broad strokes and then move to specifics, right? Makes sense, super simple. But what you kind of see is that people, I see two axes of people actually growing through this. Either it's the capability of the team, or it's the understanding of risk. And what I mean by that is they know really good what their problems are, or they know really good how to do something about it. So what you kind of see is you usually see people starting with high-level stuff, you know, this is a topic, business email compromise is a problem. Okay, sounds good. Incident with peers, we saw that, okay. But what you kind of see, for example, with the upper axis, the black arrow, is that people with a lot of expertise, they instantly want to know more. They want to know exactly how did they do it? How did you follow up on that? What were the details, right? So you see this axis actually moving a bit further to the so-called tactics, techniques, and procedures, like detailed procedures. Can we roll that up into techniques? Can we do something more on that? And you kind of see these people also ending up, obviously, with concepts like threat actors, people who have the capability and intent to do something, to exploit a certain opportunity. Vice versa, on the bottom, the blue arrow, you can see a different approach. You see that people tend to understand the risk very granularly, but then they try to move into, hey, can we hypothesize new things we haven't thought of, right? We have 40 different risk scenarios, but what is actually trending right now? You know, can we hypothesize what is trending right now? Can we maybe forecast some concepts we saw that we haven't thought about? That is what I think the CTI team should be doing, or at least one of the things. But you kind of see these things coming together in a threat landscape. And then and this is certainly not a maturity chart or anything. I'm not trying to purvey that. What I am saying is this is usually what I've seen in the last 10 years, how people grow. And then you end up with people talking about people doing that. They talk about, hey, can we do something about the behavioral elements? And can we actually think ahead about certain things that we haven't thought about? Now, the main thing, why you should do this, right? Why should we do this, Gert-Jan? Yeah, I think because you should. It's a good opportunity for each and every one of you to actually, with minimal effort, align the thinking and language on threats to your organization. What I mean by that is that this is, so yesterday, as I mentioned, we had a 4-hour session on that. I think we can even do a 3-day session. I think we can even do a 5-week, whatever. This is a lot of work to actually build these kind of deliverables. And I do not underestimate that. But what I do think is that it is a golden opportunity for people with, who really focus. So some of you in the room, perhaps, you're really focused on a really technical topic. But what we found out, for example, yesterday, is a lot of people actually struggle to boil these technical topics up into, give me the 2-row summary of what is happening. That kind of stuff. And what is better to have summaries of those details in something like a threat landscape? If you're interested in some kind of details or want to know more about that training, please hit me up after this session and I can share some access to the training platform. You can have access to the templates, etc. But this is a simple way, I think, cost-effective way. Do it once a year, do it once a quarter. Just grab a simple thing and just try to tell your story, but in 1 or 2 pages. And you wouldn't believe the impact it has on your organization. Now, how do you do that? So obviously, you will see this. You will not see that happening a lot, but you will see this type of process being referred to often. But we'll not go into that in detail. What I do want to say is that by nature, you will go through all of these process steps, right? You will actually address something like, hey, we probably need to sketch out something, but what do you actually want? That's your directional elements, that's the intel requirements. Then you probably need to figure out how to answer those questions, right? So that's probably your collection and your sourcing. And then you need to figure out, okay, so how does this work for me? Do we need to use brown or yellow? I don't know. That's your analysis bit, maybe. And then once it's done, you throw it over the fence and you're done with it. That's dissemination. And you see this stuff happening often, but this is how you quickly go through the steps. I think I'll now dive into a few steps in detail, just to illustrate how you would actually do that in a fundamental aspect, just to give you some pointers on where I think this is what is important to keep in mind with the process. So in this particular matrix, this is, I think probably everyone has seen this kind of thing, it's just a stakeholder matrix. But you wouldn't believe how little people actually use this kind of concept. I think this is a thing specifically focused on the power and influence. And I think that is important to note because with threat landscapes, you always want to get the right stakeholders who can make a strategic impact. So really mapping that out, it allows you to then use a consultative approach and say, hey, maybe we need to engage with these people because they actually should be in this quadrant or not. Having a good understanding of that is really important. Then soliciting requirements. If you know who the people are, then you probably should have a conversation with them, right? And there's a couple ways how you can do it. I personally prefer a more personal way because I found that way more successful. Having an interview with somebody that allows me to ask deeper questions because sometimes people just don't know what they need for this kind of product, right? So they just tell me, oh, do something what you think is, I'm okay, but why? What will you do? What is the action you will take? And these are some of the questions you cannot answer with a questionnaire, or you cannot answer those with a guesstimate, right? So different options. I encourage you to always take a personal approach on this. Now this is the terrible part of each and every one of us sometimes, right? The designing of the deliverable, like, oh God, how are we gonna do this? I'm not a creative person. Well, I think you all are creative persons because we humans are hardwired to process visual content more effective than text, right? I think that's a fundamental thing going back to when we were still chasing lions or stuff like that, but I do think that same concept still applies to this day. And this step, in my opinion, is the most underappreciated step when you create this kind of deliverable. And what I mean by that is that if you do the research and then start to talk about the deliverable, that means that you've done all the work, but then it could be that afterwards you have to leave out a lot of content, right? Because why did you do all that detailed stuff? We're going to put that in the annex, or we're going to remove that altogether. And you're like, oh shit, we did like 2 weeks of effort on that, right? What helps is to have that discussion early, to have a discussion early with people saying, well, I made some doodles here. Is this more or less what you want? It's not about the content, but is this already something you have, you know? And I found that approach really effective because that allowed me, one, to connect with my stakeholders, to have a personal conversation with them, and two, actually also try new stuff out. Hey, we're thinking about doing something which is just one page. It saves us a lot of time. Is that okay? And people will respond positively on that. People love to interact and think with you. A very important step, keep that in mind. Do not underestimate this particular step and engage your stakeholders, engage your clients with this particular component. Then your toolkit. You know exactly who you need to go for what, but then you need to figure out, hey, what do I need? What is the paint, the particular colors I need, the costs? What is it exactly that you need to get your stuff done? And this is about then making a connection between the questions and where do you get the answers, right? So yesterday there was two extensive session on intelligence planning. I know it's a complex exercise, and a lot of you probably aren't ready for that kind of thing, right? And that is okay, but that could be the next step. But it's important to already think about, hey, we probably need to have some questions we need to have answered, and we need to register somewhere that we need to have a certain source to answer that, because we want to rate that kind of thing, right? That is a bit the collection and source management in a nutshell. This is too detailed to go into like 30 minutes, but you kind of get the point. One important comment I do like to make is the processing part, which is often underappreciated. We, in the Western world, tend to have an English bias, so to say. So we tend to focus on all content, which is just English written, right? But for example, I'm from the Netherlands. I look at Dutch papers, and that could be sometimes different, right? But maybe you are in a certain geography, which is not, that has specific research in a specific area. Let's say a certain region in the east of Europe, right? Then you need to process that language more effectively to translate it so that you can actually use it, because not all your analysts speak the same language. And this may sound like a simple thing, but a lot of teams do not take this into consideration. And then producing it. It's like you're all over the place, right? So when you're trying to align actually the narrative on threads and put that in whatever, thread landscape or your briefings or whatever, you just need to do the hard work. And it's tedious, it is annoying, and it takes you time. There are no shortcuts, my friends. There are no shortcuts in this particular process. And I think we live also in an industry, and I think one of the previous speakers also alluded to that, we are always on, and it just takes time. And that is just the case. The only point I want to make here is that, when you do the analysis I'm not going to go through exactly those steps, but the point I'm trying to make here is that you have to do the work to get to the conclusions, and that is fine, but just remember, this takes time. Oh, that rhymes, right? The final step is actually then packaging it up nicely, making sure that you reviewed the content accordingly, making sure that you have peer-reviewed it, senior review, editorial review, right? Different tiers in your organization. keep in mind that your stakeholders could be maybe your CISO or even just your boss, you know? And you have to sometimes think that this deliverable could be a very politically sensitive deliverable as well, all right? If you are, for example, addressing an area which you think is very important, but you know, your boss has a certain different flow to that, you might want to get that sorted out, preferably already in the Intel requirements stage, right? But then again, you know, once you wrap that up, once you wrap the deliverable up, you would send it out to your particular stakeholders, and you would hang it up for them to look at. No, you're not doing that. You actually actively engage with them. You send it to them, and then you ask specifically, like, hey, what did you think afterwards? We are notoriously bad at this. I would argue that more than half, more than 3/4 of everyone in this room does not actively solicit feedback on their intelligence deliverables. It's a bold statement, but I'm bold as well, so that's good. But I like to think that this is a very difficult topic to do, right? So a few words on feedback. I think what is key is experiment, show examples early, talked about that as well, peer review, and improve iteratively. And what does that mean? That if people actually see differences between quarters, they're actually like, wow, these folks are actually up to something. They know exactly what they're talking about. And they listen, you know, and they listen. I think the listening part is sometimes really underappreciated because, yeah, you can give feedback, but if you don't see the feedback coming, you know, being dealt with, then you're like, why am I spending now 10 minutes of actually giving you feedback, right? So it's very important to keep that in mind, that if you demonstrate iterative improvements, that will give you also street creds with your stakeholders. Quick win. Now, a couple of lessons I learned from the trenches, and then I'm looking to wrap it up a bit, just sharing some examples on what I found over the years. And I promise I won't make it long. I will keep it tight. But I think one of the main things I usually see doing wrong is like, what is the format we should use? And I think in general, there's so many ways how you can approach this kind of deliverables. If you look at, if you just, in your search bar, if you just Google for like threat landscape 2022 or 2023, you will get approximately 700 results. And if you go through that, you will have approximately 22 reports, even more that you have to paywall or fill in your soul, etc. in. But I think the essence of it is that they all have different formats. They all have different visualizations, different use cases to that. And I think it's important that you need to recognize what is the format that you need for this kind of concept. Are you more of an organization that works with the complete overview of the entire spectrum, which could be a 50 to 250 page report on a specific topic, right? It could also be that they just want to see the mountain range, that they just want to see a constant tracker on what is going on over that particular area. And that maybe it's your team's purpose to actually keep track of everything else, but they just want to know that, right? Or even, you know, maybe they just want to know about that little tree in front, or RFI that, and that is the only thing people want to do. But it's important for you to recognize what is the differences between these different formats, and there are plenty, and these are just 4 often used examples. Now, I already alluded to this in the design stage of building such a thing. And again, I'm a bit of a creative person, so I enjoy these kind of things, but I recognize that not everyone is like me on that extent, right? But if you compare, for example, the yellow block with the picture, then you kind of see like, this is your research, it's boring text, maybe for some, but you know, if you try to make it a bit more appealing then, and have a discussion on, is this something that you like, then people get engaged. They open up to you. They're like, okay, your research sounds sound. So where are the details, right? So they often, what I tend to see in practice is that if you have a good and compelling story that you want to take them through the design journey, then they will join you and they are more likely to accept your research than if you don't. It's all about engagement, if you ask me. So this can also allow you to already think like, okay, we'll probably have something around 10 to 50, 10 pages, right? How do you want to do that? Like, what do we need to do? All those, for example, yesterday I made the reference of, and some of you might have recognized this, if you put, for example, a MITRE ATT&CK table in a Word document, then the entire format goes to shit, because then you get 200 pages, right? That is the common problem for everyone. But I'd like to think that you can have a discussion like, do we actually have to keep this in? Do we actually, maybe we should keep it out, right? That is a good discussion to have. And another tip is, hey, maybe we can use the requirements as an example for the structure. That is also something that can help you, and that's something you can discuss with your stakeholders. Visualizations. There are many of them, and I tend to like a couple, but I just highlighted 4. And it's not about these exact 4, but what I'd like to emphasize is that what is common across all of them is that we all have data sets we want to visualize, and I think that visualizations are better than anything we have if you use them correctly. A few examples like timelines. I love timelines. It's obviously timeline-based, but I tend to think that these are often underutilized, because I think that it's usually referenced as an incident. Hey, this is something that's happened over time. But I tend to think that, hey, we can also use this and say, hey, maybe we can show a secondary axis and show some more stuff that we actually did to combat that. And that paints a completely different picture than just saying, hey, this is an incident and this is how it went, but also saying adding another layer, adds another layer of interesting complexity, which allows your stakeholder to think better about it. Flow diagrams, not often used in threat landscapes, but still very interesting. Sometimes you see that in political organizations. If they are more likely to understand the process, then they are more likely also to say, this is where the process is hammering. And then you see these kind of things happening. Tables. We all love tables, right? We're all a big fan of tables because then we can look on ourselves. I think that is cool. It's still a predominant thing. Always try to emphasize when you use them in this particular concept of a threat landscape, keep them simple, but just make sure that they contribute to your story. Finally, relationship diagrams. It is awesome to see this kind of thing, right? But it's terrible to put it in a document because everybody gets lost, right? What are you going to do? Paste the entire thing, the entire multi-go graph in the deliverable? That's not going to fly, at least not with the executives I used to work with. They will immediately ask you to keep it separate, etc. But, however, it is a good way to demonstrate the thought process about certain things. And you could really use this to have a brainstorming conversation with certain people on this particular topic. I enjoy this one very much. Fourth, using assessments. Or, in other words, this is probably recognizable for some of you from the Intel community or have background in that, confidence language, estimative language, assessments. You think of something, but what do you think and how confident are you in that, right? This is something that is underappreciated in the private sector, sometimes not even well understood, that there is something like a confidence language, that you can be sure of how long that takes or how sure you are that that is a bandwidth. Now that being said, this is just an example on how you can use it, and I encourage you to actually incorporate this in your threat landscapes as well, because then you can also map back and look at, hey, how did we do over time? What did we see happening, and what did we think that something was happening, and did it actually happen? That's also a great opening for critical thinking. I'm almost wrapping up, my friend. Final comment, considering your audience, all of you. If I make a product for one of you, it could be not the same for another person, right? So you have to really make it clear, like, what are the decision makers we're dealing with, Is it only decision makers? Do they want details? Or do we have to have all the analyst content in there as well? It doesn't matter what you select. It matters that you make a conscious decision. That is more important. And finally, we all love pyramids. I made one of my own. I encourage all of you to actually look at this concept and do it tomorrow. And what I mean by that is just, we tend to have a lot of detail, think a lot about details, research. Oh, we have made this cool graph, left to right. But I tend to think that we're really bad at summarizing content. What I mean by that is, can you actually explain to me in 1 or 2 sentences what you just presented to me in this 250-page report? And I tell you, a lot of people struggle with that. And that is okay. But I think we as an industry, we should be really getting better in doing this kind of thing. Can we move better to the details? Can we summarize better? Can you explain to me this thing in 2 seconds because I only have 1 minute? Go. Finally, an example. One of many. There are many. This is, for example, this thing is just one page. This is only one page you will see out of a complex document. But this was just a simple example where we just listed everything bulleted in 3 categories. And this was made for an audience that wasn't really that technical, that doesn't really have a lot of staff to do this kind of thing. But in the end, they needed something quick and tangible to put on somebody's desk. So that became our use case to actually build this kind of thing. So if you look at closely on the left, you also see a cutting line. So people would actually be able to cut that out and have a physical conversation with that on their desk with their executive. It may sound stupid, but in this day and age, people still have a tactile love. People still love to hold something in their hands. So never underestimate that. Couple of do's and don'ts, and then I'm done. Don't use fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Jimmy talked about that as well. I think that doesn't work, especially in this concept. What works is talking about opportunity. If we, for example, see something and you already did something about it, can you actually tell that to somebody? And that will allow you to talk about a positive spin of that negative thing. APTs versus commodity cybercrime. A lot of people emphasize, hey, we have APT XYZ. But in fact, if you look at the statistics, you actually see that common cybercrime is more prevalent than the others. It's not about one or the other. It's about making sure that you note those nuances. Third, indicators of compromise. I think Jimmy also listed that in his historical track. Like, this is where we came from. We're now moving into the TTP area, but it's actually all the same, the same story. So actually just make sure that you nuance that correctly. What I do recommend you to do, and when you build your Q4 22, or maybe your next year's threat landscape, think about using visuals. Not a lot of text, try to visualize stuff more. Second, prepare for follow-up questions. What's next? What's the course of action? What will be happening next? And third, keep in mind that less is always more for decision makers. We always try to do more, give more, but keep more for the analysts and not for the executives or your main stakeholders. And with that, I'd like to leave you off. And if you have any more questions, if you'd like to know more about this kind of stuff, hit me up on one of these contact sheets, or I'll be here all day. Thank you.